The sound was a dull, metallic clank that echoed in the concrete throat of the service stairwell. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was final. The security guard, whose name I didn't know, turned from the door, and the space, which had felt merely small, suddenly felt airless. He was a wall of dark blue uniform, broad shoulders blocking the weak light from the single caged bulb overhead. He hadn't said a word since he'd found me on the 32nd floor, a lone ghost in a skyscraper of sleeping computer terminals. He'd just beckoned with a jerk of his head, his expression unreadable, and I, too tired and startled to question, had followed. Now he pressed me back. It wasn't a shove. It was a slow, deliberate pressure, the palm of his hand flat against my sternum. My back met the cold, gritty concrete of the wall, and the vibration of it went straight through my thin shirt into my bones. My heart, which had been thumping a steady rhythm of late-night anxiety, kicked into a frantic, panicked beat against his hand. He had to feel it. He had to know he was touching the very cage of my terror. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was low, a gravelly thing that seemed to absorb the already scant light in the stairwell. It wasn't angry. It was something else, something I couldn't place. The elevator was out. I managed my own voice a pathetic squeak. The main doors wouldn't open. I was just trying to find a way down. His eyes, dark and deep-set under the brim of his cap, scanned my face. I felt like a specimen under glass, every nervous twitch, every flicker of my eyelashes, noted and catalogued. He was older than me, maybe by 10 years. Lines etched the corners of his eyes, and a faint dusting of silver was visible at his temples. The scent of him filled the small space. Clean, sharp laundry soap, a faint hint of coffee, and something else, something uniquely him, a warm, musky scent that was both intimidating and deeply unsettling. "The building is in lockdown," he said, his hand still a firm, warm weight on my chest. There was a silent alarm triggered on the 40th floor. No one goes in or out until we get the all clear. Oh, the word was a puff of air. I hadn't known. I'd been so lost in the lines of code, the meticulous arrangement of pixels for the marketing deck due tomorrow, that the world outside my monitor had ceased to exist. I was an island of light in an ocean of corporate darkness. He didn't move his hand. I was acutely aware of it, of the heat seeping through the fabric of my shirt, of the slight calluses on his palm. I could feel the individual shape of his fingers pressing into me. My breath hitched. This was the most intimate contact I'd had with another human being in months. And it was with a stranger, a man with a sidearm holstered at his hip and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. My life had become a series of quiet, sterile routines. I woke up in my quiet, sterile apartment. I took the quiet, sterile train to this quiet, sterile office building. I worked until my eyes burned, fueled by lukewarm coffee from the break room machine, and then I went home. I was a ghost haunting the edges of my own existence, and I had been for a long time. The loneliness wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a dull, constant ache, the background noise of my life. I'd grown so accustomed to it that I barely noticed it, until moments like this, when the sudden, unexpected touch of another person reminded me of how truly starved I was. He must have seen the shift in my expression, the flicker of something that wasn't just fear. His gaze intensified, and for a fraction of a second, I saw something in his eyes, a question. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind a wall of professionalism. He slowly, very slowly, removed his hand from my chest. The absence of its weight was immediate and profound. A cold spot bloomed where his warmth had been, and I felt a ridiculous, inexplicable urge to have it back. "We wait here," he stated, his voice returning to that flat, authoritative tone. He moved to stand a few feet away, leaning against the opposite wall, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The posture was casual, but his eyes never stopped scanning the cramped space, flicking from the door to me, then up the concrete steps that disappeared into darkness. We stood in silence. The only sounds were the faint hum of the building's circulatory system and our own breathing. My breath was still shallow, ragged. His was slow and steady, a quiet, rhythmic counterpoint to my own internal chaos. I watched him from the corner of my eye, trying to be subtle. The uniform, which had looked merely functional from a distance, fit him in a way that suggested a powerful physique beneath. It pulled taut across his shoulders and biceps when he crossed his arms. His hands were large, capable-looking. The hand that had been on my chest. My mind, a traitorous and overactive thing, replayed the sensation. The pressure, the heat. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. This was absurd. I was trapped in a stairwell with a security guard during a potential emergency, and my brain was fixated on the touch of his hand. It was a testament to the sheer, desolate emptiness of my life. That night set a new pattern. The lockdown had been a false alarm, a faulty sensor on a server room door. After 20 minutes of taut silence, his radio crackled to life with an all clear, and he'd led me down to the lobby without another word, his presence a silent, heavy weight behind me. He'd unlocked the main doors and held one open for me. As I passed, my shoulder brushed his arm. It was nothing, a fleeting accident, but a jolt went through me all the same. I'd mumbled a thank you and practically fled into the cool night air, my heart hammering a rhythm that was no longer about fear. I started working late more often. Not just late, but late. Until I was the last one. Until the cleaning crews had come and gone, and the building settled into its deep, nocturnal slumber. I told myself it was because of my workload, the impending deadlines, the need to get ahead. It was a lie. I was waiting. I was watching. I'd see him on his rounds. Sometimes just a glimpse of his dark blue uniform passing the glass wall of my office. Sometimes he'd be a figure on the security monitors I could see from my desk, a steady, solitary presence striding down empty hallways. I learned the rhythm of his patrol. 11:15, he'd pass my floor. 1:30, he'd do a check of the server wing. 3:45, a final sweep before the morning shift arrived. He became the focal point of my lonely nights. A silent, unknowable constant. I learned the sound of his footsteps, the specific squeak of his leather duty belt. I learned that he always had a thermos of coffee on the main lobby desk, and that he'd sometimes stand and stare out at the city lights for long stretches, his silhouette perfectly still. My observations were my secret, a private obsession cultivated in the sterile glow of my computer screen. I never spoke to him. I'd see him at the main desk when I finally left, and I'd offer a tight, nervous nod, which he would return with an equally brief, unsmiling one of his own. The chasm between us felt a mile wide. He was the guard. I was the late-working drone. We were two separate, non-intersecting orbits. But I couldn't forget the feeling of his hand on my chest. I couldn't forget the weight of it, the heat of it. It was a brand, a single point of contact that had seared itself into my memory. My overthinking mind, starved for any kind of stimulus, took that single moment and spun it into 1,000 different narratives. Was it just a professional action, a way to control a potential threat? Or had there been something else in it? A hesitation? A flicker of curiosity in his eyes? I analyzed it from every angle, dissecting the memory until it was worn smooth, a worry stone in the palm of my mind. One Tuesday night, or perhaps it was a Wednesday morning by then, I was packing up my bag when he appeared at the door of my office. I hadn't heard him approach. I jumped, a small, startled gasp escaping my lips. "Sorry," he said, his voice that same low rumble. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." He was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper than usual. "It's fine," I said, my heart doing its familiar frantic dance. "I was just leaving." "You're always just leaving," he observed. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Mr. Hayes, right?" "Leo Hayes." He knew my name. My full name. A ridiculous warmth spread through my chest. It was absurd to be so pleased by something so simple, but I was. In a life where I felt largely invisible, being named felt like being seen. "Yeah, Leo, Julian," he said, offering his own name in return. He didn't offer a hand, just the name, a small, solid piece of himself. Julian. The name suited him. It was strong, steady. An awkward silence fell between us. I fumbled with the strap of my messenger bag, my fingers suddenly clumsy. I didn't know what to say. What did one say to the silent, watchful guardian of their lonely nights? "Thanks for being the object of my quiet, desperate obsession." "Floors wet down by the elevators," he said, breaking the silence. "Cleaning crew just finished. Be careful." "Okay, thanks." He nodded, then pushed off the doorframe. "Have a good night, Leo." He used my first name again. It landed differently this time, more familiar, intimate, almost. As he walked away, I stood frozen, my bag half on my shoulder. It was the longest conversation we'd ever had, and it was about a wet floor. And yet, it felt monumental. He had sought me out. He had used my name. He had warned me of a minor danger. It was a form of care, wasn't it? A small, professional courtesy that my lonely heart inflated into something more. The next week, the small interactions continued. A nod became, working hard. A silent elevator ride down to the lobby together became, looks like rain tomorrow. Each word was a tiny breadcrumb, and I was starving. I gathered them, hoarded them, examined them late at night in the solitude of my apartment. Then came the touch. It was a Friday. I was exhausted, having pulled an all-nighter to finish a project. As I was swiping my access card to leave, I fumbled it, dropping it on the floor. We both bent down to get it at the same time. Our heads nearly collided. I recoiled, embarrassed, and as I did, his hand came up to steady me, landing squarely on my shoulder. It was different from the hand on my chest. That had been about control, authority. This was gentler. His fingers squeezed my shoulder for a brief moment before he picked up the card and handed it to me. "Easy there," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger. "Thanks," I mumbled, my face burning. Our fingers brushed as I took the card, another small, electric shock. I couldn't meet his eyes. I just swiped the card again and hurried out into the night, the feeling of his hand imprinted on my shoulder, a warm, heavy phantom. I started to wonder if I was imagining it all. The lingering looks, the small courtesies that felt like more. Was I just so desperate for connection that I was manufacturing it out of thin air? Projecting my own yearning onto a man who was just doing his job? It was the most likely explanation. I was the weirdo who worked all night, the lonely guy with the overactive imagination. He was probably just being polite, maybe even a little pitying. The thought was a cold, sobering splash of water. I decided to pull back. I started leaving earlier, at a more reasonable hour, forcing myself to pack up and go when the first of the cleaning crew arrived. I avoided the lobby, taking a different elevator bank. I tried to restore the professional distance, to put him back in the box of building security, just another part of the scenery. It lasted for 3 days. 3 days of leaving at 8 o'clock, of eating a solitary dinner at a normal hour, of watching television in my silent apartment and feeling the loneliness more acutely than ever. The ache was back, sharper now that I'd had a brief taste of something that felt like a cure. The quiet of my apartment felt different. It wasn't peaceful, it was empty. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant wail of a siren, they all seemed to amplify the silence, the profound and total absence of another human being. On the 4th day, I caved. I stayed. I worked until midnight, then 1, then 2. The building fell silent around me, and a strange sense of peace settled over me. This was my world, this bubble of light and quiet industry, and he was a part of it. Denying that felt like denying a part of myself. At around 2:15, I heard the familiar squeak of his shoes. My breath caught in my throat. I kept my eyes fixed on my screen, pretending to be engrossed in my work. He paused at my doorway. I could feel his presence, a weight in the air. I risked a glance. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my screen, at the intricate design I was painstakingly crafting. "What is that?" he asked, his voice quiet. It's a logo design," I said, turning slightly in my chair. "For a new biotech firm." He stepped into the office, a breach of our unspoken boundary. He walked over to my desk, his proximity making the hairs on my arm stand up. He smelled of coffee and the cool night air that clung to his uniform. He leaned over slightly to get a better look, one hand resting on the back of my chair. His knuckles were inches from my neck. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Huh," he said, his eyes tracing the lines of the design. "It's good. Looks complex. It's supposed to represent a DNA helix, but also a growing plant," I explained, my voice barely a whisper. I was so aware of him, of his physical presence, that forming a coherent sentence felt like a monumental effort. "I see it," he said after a moment. He straightened up, but his hand remained on my chair. "You're talented." The compliment landed like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples of warmth through me. No one had said that to me in a long time. My work was usually received with corporate jargon, synergistic, on brand. Impactful but talented, that was personal. Thank you, I said, finally turning to look up at him. His expression was serious, his gaze direct. That unreadable quality was still there, but now it felt less like a wall and more like a deep, quiet body of water. I had the sudden, dizzying feeling that if I looked long enough, I might see what was moving in the depths. You shouldn't work so hard, he said, his voice soft. It's not good for you, staying up here all alone. Was that concern in his voice? Real, genuine concern? My heart did a slow, painful flip in my chest. I'm not alone when you're here, I thought, but the words were a lead weight on my tongue. I couldn't say that. I couldn't possibly say that. I have to, I said instead, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. Deadlines. He held my gaze for a long moment, and I knew he didn't believe me. He knew I was lying. A silent communication passed between us, an acknowledgement of the pretense. He knew I stayed for a reason that had nothing to do with work, and I knew that he knew. And yet, neither of us said it. The air in the office was thick with unspoken things. Then, the unthinkable happened. A massive, building-shaking shudder, followed by the groan of tortured metal. The lights flickered violently, once, twice, and then died completely. We were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. My own sharp intake of breath was unnaturally loud in the sudden, total silence. The hum of the computers, the HVAC, the city outside, all gone. It was a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. For a terrifying second, I was completely disoriented. Then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. His hand, solid, warm, and sure in the pitch black. Stay put, Julian's voice commanded, close to my ear. It was calm, devoid of any panic. His presence was a sudden, grounding anchor in the terrifying void. A small click, and then a powerful beam of light cut through the darkness, originating from a flashlight in his other hand. The beam danced around the room, illuminating familiar objects in a stark, alien way, my desk, my chair, the ghostly pale of my monitor. What was that? I asked, my voice trembling. Transformer blue, sounds like, he said, his hand still a reassuring weight on my shoulder. Whole grid for this block is probably down. We're on emergency backup, but that only covers the stairwell lights and the alarm systems. He was so calm. It was a deep, professional calm that flowed from him and into me, steadying my frantic nerves. He was in his element. This was a problem he knew how to solve. Are we stuck here? For a while, probably, he said. He moved the flashlight beam to my face, and I squinted against the brightness. You okay? I think so, I said, though my heart was still trying to beat its way out of my ribcage. Good. Stay with me. He squeezed my shoulder once, a brief, firm pressure, before letting go. The loss of contact was jarring, and I had to resist the urge to reach out for him in the dark. He moved through the office, the beam of his flashlight a roving, investigative eye. He checked the windows, the door. All right, he said, coming back to me. Here's the plan. We can't use the elevators. We'll have to take the stairs. But I need to do a full sweep of the upper floors first. Make sure no one else is stranded. I want you to stay here. Lock the door behind me. I'll be back for you. Understood. You're going to leave me here? In the dark? The question came out sounding more childish and panicked than I intended. He paused, turning the flashlight beam so it pointed at the ceiling, casting us both in a soft, indirect glow. I could see his face more clearly now. His expression was serious, but the hardness was gone. It's the safest place for you to be, he said, his voice gentle. I'll know right where you are. I don't want you wandering around in the dark. You could fall, get hurt, he hesitated, then added. I'll be as quick as I can. I promise. There was that word again. Care. It was undeniable this time. I looked at him, this man who was essentially a stranger, and felt a profound sense of safety I hadn't felt in years. I trusted him completely. Okay, I whispered. Okay. He gave me a curt nod, then turned to leave. At the door, he stopped and looked back. Leo, he said. Don't worry. I've got this. And then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the dark, silent hallway. I locked the door as he'd instructed, the click of the bolt echoing in the oppressive silence. I was alone in the dark on the 32nd floor of a dead skyscraper. But for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel lonely. I felt waited for. The wait was agonizing. Every creak of the building settling, every distant sound from the street below was magnified in the silence. I sat in my office chair, the darkness a thick, tangible blanket around me. I couldn't see anything, so my other senses went into overdrive. I could smell the faint, clean scent Julian had left in his wake. I could feel the cool leather of the chair against my skin. I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart. I thought about him moving through the dark floors above, his flashlight beam cutting through the blackness. He was a guardian in the truest sense, a solitary protector of this vast, empty space. And he had promised to come back for me. The thought was a small, warm coal in the center of my chest. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 45 minutes before I heard his footsteps returning. My entire body tensed with relief. A soft knock on the door. "Leo? It's me." I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking, and pulled the door open. He was there, his flashlight beam pointed at the floor. "All clear," he said. "Just us. You ready to go?" "Yes," I breathed. "Stick close to me," he instructed. "I'll light the way. The emergency lights in the stairwells are on, but they're not bright." I followed him out into the hallway. It was an eerie, alien landscape. The familiar corporate corridor was transformed by the darkness, full of strange shadows and unsettling voids. Julian's presence was the only solid, real thing in it. I stayed so close behind him that I could feel the heat from his body, could smell that comforting scent of soap and coffee. We reached the service stairwell, the same one from that first night. The memory of it, of his hand on my chest, rose up, vivid and immediate. The single caged bulb at each landing was glowing with a weak, orange light, casting long, distorted shadows. It was barely enough to see by. 32 flights, Julian said, his voice echoing slightly in the concrete enclosure. "We'll take it slow." He started down, and I followed. The rhythmic clump of his boots on the concrete steps was a steadying beat. We descended in silence for the first few floors. The air was cool and smelled of dust and damp concrete. Around the 25th floor, my knee, an old injury from a college soccer game, started to ache. I tried to hide my limp, but the stairwell was too quiet, the rhythm of our descent too steady. My uneven footfalls were a clear disruption. "You all right?" Julian asked, stopping and turning to look up at me from a few steps below. The low light caught the sharp angles of his face, casting his eyes in deep shadow. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just old injury acting up." He didn't call me on the lie. He just watched me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Here," he said, and he reached up, offering me his hand. "Lean on me a bit." No sense in being a hero. My heart stopped. I stared at his outstretched hand. It was large and steady, the palm turned up in a simple, unambiguous offer of support. This wasn't a touch of authority or a fleeting accident. This was a conscious choice, an invitation. Hesitantly, I reached out and took it. His skin was warm and slightly rough, his grip firm and enveloping. He laced his fingers through mine, a simple, secure gesture that sent a bolt of lightning straight up my arm. He tugged gently, pulling me down the last few steps until I was standing beside him on the landing. He didn't let go. "Better?" he asked, his voice low. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my throat tight. We stood there for a moment on the dim, dusty landing, our hands linked. It was the most earth-shatteringly intimate thing I had ever experienced. The simple, solid connection of our hands in the near darkness felt more profound than any kiss I could imagine. He started walking again, and I walked with him, our joined hands swinging gently between us. We descended the rest of the way like that, in a silence that was no longer awkward or tense, but filled with a strange, humming energy. I focused on the feeling of his hand holding mine, on the rhythmic brush of our shoulders as we walked. My world had shrunk to this single point of contact, and it was more than enough. When we finally reached the ground floor lobby, it was still pitch black, the huge glass windows showing only a void where the city should have been. A few emergency lights cast a ghostly pallor over the marble floors. Julian finally let go of my hand to unlock one of the main doors. The absence of his touch was immediate and sharp. I felt cold again. "Streetlights are out for blocks," he said, peering outside. "You drive?" "No, I take the train." He turned to look at me, a frown creasing his brow. "The trains won't be running." "Nothing will be." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Where do you live?" I told him my neighborhood, About 6 miles away. He nodded slowly. My truck's in the underground garage. It'll run. I'll take you home. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He was taking me home. The thought of being enclosed with him in the small cabin of his truck sent another jolt through me, a mixture of terror and elation. You don't have to do that, I said, the protest weak even to my own ears. I'm not letting you walk home in a blackout, Leo, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Come on. He led me towards the garage, his flashlight beam bobbing ahead of us. His truck was an older model, big and solid-looking, its dark paint barely visible in the gloom. The interior smelled of old leather, coffee, and that same faint, personal scent of his. It felt like an extension of him. The drive through the blacked-out city was surreal. It was like navigating a ghost town. The familiar streets were unrecognizable without their usual bath of electric light. The only illumination came from our headlights, cutting a lonely path through the darkness. Inside the truck, the silence was different. It was smaller, more concentrated. I was intensely aware of him next to me, of the way his large hands handled the steering wheel, the quiet sound of his breathing. I stared out the window, watching the dark, dead buildings slide by, my mind racing. What was happening here? Was this just him being a good guy, a diligent security guard going above and beyond? Or was it something more? The hand-holding in the stairwell, that felt like more. But maybe I was misreading it. Maybe it was just a gesture of support, something he would have done for anyone. You're quiet, he said, his voice startling me out of my thoughts. Just taking it all in, I said. I've never seen the city like this. Happens every decade or so, he said. People forget how fragile it all is. How much we rely on this invisible power. One transformer blows, and we're all back in the dark ages. There was a philosophical bent to his words that surprised me. I had him pegged as a man of action, not introspection. I was realizing how little I actually knew about him, beyond the superficial details I'd observed from afar. Do you like your job? I asked, the question feeling bold, transgressive. He was quiet for a long moment. It's quiet, he said finally. I like the quiet. I like the routine. You see a lot, watching a building sleep. You see the patterns. The people who are dedicated, the people who are just passing time, he paused. You see the ones who are lonely. My breath caught in my chest. He didn't look at me when he said it, kept his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, but the words hung in the air between us, heavy and pointed. He was talking about me. He saw me. He saw my loneliness. I didn't know how to respond. The truth of his statement was a hard, painful lump in my throat. Admitting it felt like surrendering a piece of myself, a vulnerability I wasn't prepared for. So I said nothing. We drove the rest of the way in that charged silence. When we pulled up in front of my apartment building, a dark, silent monolith like all the others, I felt a pang of disappointment. I didn't want it to be over. Well, I said, my hand on the door handle. Here we are. Thank you, Julian. For everything. For getting me out of there. For the ride. It's my job, he said, but his voice was soft, and it didn't sound like he was talking about his job at all. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was absolute. He turned in his seat to face me. In the faint, ambient glow from a distant moon, I could just make out his features. Leo, he began, then stopped. He seemed to be searching for words, a rare sight for a man who usually communicated with such economy. He lifted a hand, as if to touch my face, but then let it drop back to his lap. The aborted gesture was more potent than any touch. I started, wanting to say something, anything to fill the chasm of unspoken things between us. I stay late to see you. The thought of you is the only thing that gets me through the night. I think I'm falling for you. The words were a frantic mob in my head, all clamoring to get out. But all I said was, "Good night, Julian." I got out of the truck and walked to my building without looking back. I felt his eyes on me the whole way. I fumbled with my keys in the dark, finally got the door open, and slipped inside. Only then did I hear the sound of his truck starting up and driving away. The power was out in my apartment too, of course. I navigated by the light of my phone, my movements clumsy and disconnected. I felt like I was floating, my body untethered from reality. The night's events played on a loop in my mind. The darkness, his hand on my shoulder, our fingers laced together in the stairwell, his voice in the dark truck. You see the ones who are lonely. He saw me. He had seen me all along. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The carefully constructed walls of my invisibility had been breached. Someone was looking in. Someone was seeing the real, pathetic, lonely man hiding inside. And that someone was Julian. The next day, the power was back on. The city returned to its noisy, chaotic self, as if the blackout had been nothing but a dream. I went to work, and everything was aggressively normal. The lights were on, the computers hummed, people bustled in the hallways, complaining about the inconvenience of the power outage. It felt wrong. After a night of such heightened reality, such profound connection, returning to the mundane felt like a betrayal. I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the dark truck, to the weight of his words. I was a wreck all day, a bundle of exposed nerves. What would happen when I saw him tonight? Would we pretend it never happened? Would the professional distance slam back into place? The uncertainty was eating me alive. I stayed late. I had to. Not knowing was worse than any possible outcome. I worked, or pretended to, as the building slowly emptied out and fell into its familiar nighttime quiet. Every footstep in the hall made my head snap up. Every distant sound made my heart leap. He didn't come to my office. 11:15 passed, and he didn't walk by. 1:30 came and went. I started to panic. Was he not working tonight? Was he avoiding me? The thought was a cold dread that settled in my stomach. Maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe his kindness had been just that. Kindness, nothing more, and my desperate, yearning response had scared him off. At 3 a.m., I finally gave up. I packed my bag, my movements slow and heavy with disappointment. My grand, life-altering connection had been a one-night-only event, a strange dream born of a power outage. I felt foolish, pathetic. I took the elevator down to the lobby, my reflection in the polished steel doors a pale, miserable-looking ghost. As the doors opened, my heart sank. The lobby was empty. The main desk was unmanned. A different guard, a young kid I'd never seen before, was doing a round by the front doors. Julian wasn't there. A wave of something akin to grief washed over me. It was over. It had never even begun. I walked towards the exit, my head down, feeling the sting of tears behind my eyes. It was stupid to be this upset over a man I barely knew, but the connection had felt so real, so promising. It was the hope that was killing me, the loss of it. Leaving so early, the voice came from my right. My head snapped around. Julian was standing in the shadows by a darkened corridor, out of his uniform. He was wearing a simple dark t-shirt and jeans. The casual clothes were a shock. They made him seem both more real and more intimidating. Without the uniform, he was just a man. A very large, very solid man. "My shift ended an hour ago," he said, stepping out of the shadows. "I was waiting for you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was waiting for you. He hadn't been avoiding me. He had been waiting. I thought you weren't here," I stammered. "I'm here," he said, his voice low and steady. He took a step closer, and then another. He stopped when he was just a foot away from me. The lobby was silent, save for the distant footsteps of the other guard. We were in our own little bubble of charged air. "Last night," he said, his eyes searching mine. That wasn't just about the blackout. It was a statement, but it was also a question. He was laying his cards on the table, giving me a chance to fold, to retreat back into my safe, lonely world. I could say, "No, of course not. You were just being helpful," I could pretend. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. This was it. This was the precipice. I could step back, or I could jump. I took a breath. "No," I whispered, the word barely audible. It wasn't. A flicker of something, relief, maybe, crossed his face. It was there and gone in an instant. He took the final step that closed the distance between us. He was so close now I could feel the warmth of his body, could see the tiny flecks of gold in his dark eyes. He lifted his hand, the one that had held mine in the stairwell, and slowly, hesitantly, cupped the side of my face. His thumb brushed against my cheekbone, the touch gentle, questioning. It was the most tender gesture I had ever received. I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering shut. A shudder went through my entire body. "I can't stop thinking about you, Leo," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Up there in your office, night after night. I just watch you. And I wonder. Wonder what?" I breathed, my eyes still closed. I wonder if you're as lonely as I am. The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. It was the key that unlocked everything. My eyes snapped open. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, his expression was completely open, completely readable. I saw yearning there. I saw hope. I saw my own desperate loneliness reflected back at me. I didn't have the words to answer him. My throat was too tight, my mind too full. So I did the only thing I could. I lifted my own trembling hand and placed it over his, pressing his palm more firmly against my skin. It was an answer, an acceptance, a surrender. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a hard, demanding kiss. It was soft, searching. It was the taste of coffee and mint and something that was just him. It was the gentle pressure of his lips, the slight rasp of his stubble against my skin. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was everything I had been starving for, a deep, soul-quenching drink of water after a lifetime in the desert. I kissed him back, all my pent-up loneliness and yearning and quiet obsession pouring into the gesture. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling myself closer, and he responded by sliding his other arm around my waist, holding me securely against his solid frame. We stood there, in the middle of the empty, sterile lobby of a corporate skyscraper, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was home. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His breathing was as unsteady as my own. "Leo," he whispered, his voice ragged. I couldn't speak. I just held on to him, my knuckles white where I gripped the fabric of his shirt. This was real. This was happening. The sound of the other guards' approaching footsteps broke the spell. We pulled apart, a sudden, awkward distance between us. My face was on fire. Julian looked composed, but I saw the flush on his neck, the slight tremor in his hands. I have to go, I said, though leaving was the last thing on earth I wanted to do. "Wait," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Give me your number." I numbly recited the digits as he typed them in. He sent a test message, and my phone buzzed in my pocket. Now he had my number. We were connected, outside of this building, outside of these strange, nocturnal hours. "I'll call you," he said. It was a promise. "Tomorrow. We can, I don't know, get coffee. Like normal people." The idea of it, of seeing him in the daylight, of sitting across from him in a normal coffee shop, was both terrifying and wonderful. It was a step into a new, unknown world. "I'd like that," I said, and the smile that spread across my face felt genuine, the first real one in years. He walked me to the door, his hand a warm, protective presence on the small of my back. As I stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, he spoke my name one last time. "Leo, get some sleep." I nodded, and then I walked away, not looking back, because if I did, I might have just turned around and thrown myself back into his arms. I walked home in a daze, the city slowly waking up around me. The sky was turning from black to a soft, bruised purple. The world felt new, washed clean. I felt new. The next morning, I woke up to a panic. It hit me before I was even fully conscious, a cold wave of dread. Had I dreamed it all? The kiss, the confession, it felt too good, too perfect to be real. It was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not to quiet, invisible men like me. I scrambled for my phone, my heart pounding. I scrolled through my messages. And there it was. One new text, from an unknown number, sent at 6:30 a.m. Just got home. Thinking about you. Julian. I read the message 10 times. 20. The words were simple, but they were everything. They were proof. They were real. A giddy, bubbling relief washed through me, so potent it made me dizzy. I fell back against my pillows, holding the phone to my chest, a laugh escaping my lips. He called that afternoon. His voice on the phone was just as low and steady as it was in person, and it sent a shiver down my spine. We made a plan. Not for coffee, but for dinner. The next night. A real date. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I was useless at work, staring at my screen for hours without designing a single thing. My mind was a chaotic whirlwind of anxiety and anticipation. What would we talk about? What was he like outside of his uniform, outside of the quiet nights in the building? What if he met me in the light of day and realized he'd made a terrible mistake? My talent for overthinking, for spinning out catastrophic scenarios, was working overtime. He was waiting for me outside the restaurant, a small Italian place in a quiet neighborhood. He was wearing jeans and a soft gray Henley that stretched across his chest. Seeing him like this, a normal man waiting for a date, was almost more overwhelming than seeing him in his uniform. He looked handsome, in a rugged, unassuming way that made my stomach do a slow, nervous flip. He smiled when he saw me, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied, my voice a little breathless. The awkwardness I had feared never materialized. Dinner was easy. We talked about everything and nothing. I learned that he'd been a Marine before taking the security job, that he had a sister in Oregon, that he liked to hike in the mountains outside the city on his days off. He was quiet, but he was a good listener, asking questions that made me feel like he was genuinely interested in my answers. I told him about growing up in a small town, about my passion for art that had led me to graphic design, about the stifling loneliness of the city. I talked more than I had in years, the words just pouring out of me. He made me feel safe enough to share the parts of myself I usually kept hidden. Section. At the end of the night, he walked me home. Under the warm glow of a streetlight in front of my building, we paused. "I had a really good time tonight, Leo," he said, his voice sincere. "Me too," I said, and I meant it more than I'd ever meant anything. He reached out and took my hand, lacing our fingers together. It felt as right, as natural, as it had in the dark stairwell. He lifted my hand and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. "I want to see you again," he said, his eyes holding mine. "I want that too," I whispered. And so it began. Our lives started to intertwine, slowly and carefully. There were more dinners, trips to a museum, a long, quiet walk in the park. We learned the rhythms of each other's lives. I learned that he was a morning person, while I was a creature of the night. I learned that he had a dry, understated sense of humor that would emerge when I least expected it, making me laugh until my sides ached. He learned that I was prone to anxiety, that I overthought everything, but he never seemed to mind. He was a calming presence, a steady rock in the turbulent sea of my mind. I still stayed late at work sometimes, but now it was different. It wasn't out of loneliness, but out of a quiet, happy anticipation. He'd come find me on his break, bringing me a thermos of good, strong coffee he'd brewed at home. We'd sit in the quiet of my office for 20 minutes, just talking. The building that had once been the symbol of my isolation had become our place, the backdrop to our story. One night, a few weeks in, he found me staring out the window of my office, looking down at the river of headlights on the street below. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand beside me. I was quiet for a moment, then I confessed. "I'm thinking about how strange it is. How my entire life changed in this building. In that stairwell." He was silent, but he reached out and took my hand. "I used to feel so invisible here," I continued, my voice soft. "Like a ghost. And then you saw me." He turned to face me, his expression serious. "I always saw you, Leo," he said. "From the very first night. I saw this guy who worked too hard, who had the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. I saw you, and I wanted to know why." He squeezed my hand. "And now I do. And I don't want you to ever feel invisible again." He pulled me into a hug, wrapping his strong arms around me and holding me tight. I buried my face in his chest, breathing in his familiar, comforting scent. I felt the steady, solid beat of his heart against my ear. In his arms, I felt seen. I felt safe. I felt loved. Our first night together was quiet and perfect. It was at his apartment, a small, clean place that was as unassuming and solid as he was. There was no grand passion, no cinematic fireworks. It was a slow, gentle exploration, full of soft touches and quiet murmurs. It was an act of profound intimacy, a confirmation of everything that had grown between us in the silences and the small gestures. Lying in his bed afterwards, tangled up in his arms, with the first light of dawn creeping through the blinds, I felt a sense of peace that was so deep and total it felt like settling into my own skin for the first time. I listened to the sound of his slow, even breathing as he slept, his arm a heavy, protective weight around me. I thought back to the man I had been just a few months ago, a ghost haunting an office building, a man so starved for connection that the touch of a stranger's hand felt like a seismic event. And I looked at the man beside me, this quiet, steady, wonderful man who had seen through my invisibility and had, with patient determination, led me out of the darkness. He stirred in his sleep, his arm tightening around me, pulling me closer. He mumbled my name, a soft, sleepy sound. A wave of love so powerful it almost hurt washed over me. This was my new reality. This warmth, this safety, this quiet, unassuming man who had waited for me in the dark. I was no longer a ghost. I was here. I was seen. I was home. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would never be lonely again.